Good morning, everyone. This week's lecture is mainly about Abraham and Sarah, but I wanted to start off a little bit by looking through Carol Meyer's article called Ethno-Archaeological Analysis of the Hannah Sacrifice. Because you remember, I asked you all to think about the objects that we saw, and I believe this was in 1 Samuel 24, where Hannah brought several items to sacrifice. She brought a bull of 3 years old, she brought flour, and she brought wine. And the significance of these things, interestingly, according to Myers, is not really explored thoroughly in the commentaries, which I thought was interesting because as a text world examination showed, they were kind of unique and stuck out as something that might be important. And the reason they're important is because they're associated with this sacrifice that Hannah made when bringing her son to Eli. And so that is an important thing to consider, and it's surprising to me to hear that some of the commentaries leave them out. So Myers herself says that this is an interpretive challenge, and that her ethno-archaeological approach would be a good one to explore what the significance of these things are. And so I thought it was really interesting, and on page 82, she brings up the issue that these three different things were items that were produced in the agricultural sense in the area where Hannah lived, and talking about animal husbandry, the bull, field crops were growing, and that was the flour, and then a product from plants, which was the wine. And her conclusion is that these represented agrarian, village-centered tribal economy. Now, why is this interesting? Well, because it gives us something rather concrete to look at when we look at the story of Hannah, something that's associated with its context. And of course, what we want to figure out there in that story is something about the context of Israel's religious life and how things fit together. And so I thought this was really good. She says, again, this is page 78, the issue is the context of material reality and the sociocultural system. So there's some good material that can be brought to this text, and interestingly enough, really tacks it into its reality situation almost better than some of the things in the text do. So I wanted to bring that to your attention. And something we want to talk about today is the whole issue of interpretation. Okay, so I've had you read a short part of a short introduction that talks about feminist interpretation. And then I'd like to bring Carol Meyers to the table as a female interpreter, but one who uses approaches that she feels would be appropriate to her text. So while she does approach things from a feminist interpretation perspective sometimes, she also then goes ahead and uses her real strength, which is that of an archaeologist. So the other, the other article that you were reading for this very week is the one by Thompson. And his article is in the front of his monograph that was written in 2001. So now it's 16 years old, and we have to remember that the tide has changed again. But he gives you a little historical rundown on these waves of feminism. And at his point in time, he was looking at the second wave. A third wave has gone by, and I believe we may be now into the fourth wave. But he talks about the texts of terror, which we'll be coming to later on. And he talks about Phyllis Tribble and her idea of rejecting the Bible's patriarchy. And he points out how there also are sort of hypocritical persons that approach biblical text. And he mentions particularly somebody by the name of Hampson, who is arguing about the authority of this biblical text to really say anything to anybody as either a resource or an authority because of the hostility that they feel toward the biblical interpretive tradition. So we have a big set of issues to deal with when thinking about approaching things from a feminist perspective. I think some of this argumentation has now been put to bed a little bit since that time, but I think there still are some things remaining in this way. And I also believe that from this time until now, we also become much more aware of other types of readings and how they can be contextually oriented in other formats. So the reason why I wanted you to read Thompson was to get your anchor there as far as where we are now in the interpretive scheme of things, how things that might have seemed pretty solid then may have moved a bit, but we can still look at this as being contemporary biblical scholarship, and so we have contemporary issues that go along with it. Now, we'll have one word in this course that I'm going to have, call it a buzzword perhaps, and I really want you to define it and to park it for the term, and that's the word patriarchy. Because the word patriarchy, in the way that's being mentioned nowadays in the public sphere, is a little far from the term patriarchy when we use it to describe the situation in ancient biblical text. And it now is becoming a bit of a loaded word. And so I would prefer that we jump on board here with another one of Carol Meyer's words that she's actually started to use at one point in 2013. She was the president of the SBL, and she suggested in her address, was ancient Israel a patriarchal society? She argues for the word heterarchy. And so what I will do is to make a few notes on this and include them in the course notes so that you can see them. I ran across this discussion in a book called Claiming Her Dignity, which I just finished making a book review of not long ago and did not have time to add it to our list, but I'm going to give the title to you so you can have a look at it as well. But the point here, and I think it's a valid point, and I really want us to be thinking on these terms, the term heterarchy acknowledges the existence of hierarchies, but recognizes that different power structures can exist simultaneously in any given society, with each structure having its own hierarchical arrangements that may cross-cut each other laterally. And again, this is from her SBL address, and then it's also written up in the Journal of Biblical Literature. So I'm going to pass that information on to you. Here's the book, Claiming Her Dignity. It's quite good, and perhaps I'll be able to add some of that into our e-reserves as the course goes on. So let's think about the term heterarchy. And when you begin to read the feminist interpretation and see a lot of mention of patriarchy, be really careful that you're reading in the intention that they wrote it, not in a sort of modern, in the American Street version of patriarchy, because it's become a really loaded word, and I think it's almost gone past the point of being very productive to have these discussions about how power works in the biblical text. It's gotten so contemporized at this point in time that we have to kind of figure out a different way of talking about these things. Besides which, hierarchy really actually gives us more ways of talking about it, because you could have somebody who is a male figure who is very oppressed economically in the Old Testament and those kinds of things. So we could also have female figures who are in power in the Old Testament as well. Okay, so let's go along, and what I want you to do is to have a look at the notes that I've added. Let's see here, have to have our timer on. And we'll look at section B, Genesis 12 to 50, the stories of the ancestors, which you'll find about on page 50 of the notes. Okay, so I'm pulling out some notes that my Old Testament students will already be quite familiar with, and we'll have a look at them again, but I want to drill down this time and talk a little bit about certain things. So this lecture probably will go into two parts, so we can be sure that it goes into YouTube properly. So you might get two sets here. But we'll start here with Genesis 12 to 50 and the partitioning here of the stories of the ancestors. So Genesis 11:27 to 25:18 is the Abraham and Sarah cycle. It's a really long cycle, 24 chapters. Then we go on to Genesis 25:19 to 36:43, and you get the Jacob cycle. And then you get after that Genesis 37:1 to 50, 37:1 to 50:26, and that's the Joseph cycle. So these topics in this part of the biblical text, it's very long, and they tend to focus then on certain groups of people. Okay, so the issue today is the idea of introducing Abraham and Sarah. Okay, Abraham and Sarah is an interesting cycle to look at from a literary perspective, and so I've done some looking at this in the past. And looking at the structure and content of this section. But we can wait just a moment and talk about a little more about biblical interpretation, since that's at the top of the list here, and talk about theory and method, and talk about where meaning is found. Okay, so historical critical thinking says meaning is behind the text, and what we have to do is get a shovel and dig it out. And this is where we have our very typical biblical interpretive sorts of things, biblical languages, analysis, and other kinds of things like that, historical information that we pull from different places. And that's a really good, solid place to begin. It gives you a nice viewpoint. However, it may not give us all we want from that text. Okay, we might not have enough satisfaction about some of the literary qualities, and so we might want to look at the text from a literary perspective. In other words, a focus on the text. And this is where text world theory fits in as a linguistic, literary sort of reading, really paying attention to what goes on in the text. Now, for a while, reader response theory was popular, and that would be the meaning in front of the text. In other words, how do I feel about it? What does it say to me? That one in and of itself is a little bit narrow because it doesn't allow for thinking back to front, really. And then we could look at cognitive approaches, which talk about the interrelationship between all three, the author, the text, and the reader. So those are a certain number of things that you could look at. So literary and linguistic methods have been around for a while. Literary criticism has been around, and you might know C.S. Lewis, who is a person who actually was a literary critic before he was a theologian. And so he's a really good example of that. So we can think about that. The precursors to that are actually in the Jewish community, two fellows called Buber and Rosenzweig. And they actually wrote a Bible that was really focused on light words. In other words, where words would actually match up with each other and create meaning. And then we have C.S. Lewis, and his statement here from his book on the Psalms, I think is really appropriate. What must be said is that the Psalms are poems, and poems intended to be sung, not doctrinal treatises or sermons. The Bible, since it is after all literature, cannot be read except as literature, and the different parts of it as the different sorts of literature that they are. So when we're reading story, we're reading narrative, but it comes across as story. It's pretty important to allow it to have that story-like quality and to allow it to speak to us in those terms. Okay, and then there's the idea of new literary criticism, and you can go ahead and read that section from James Barr, Reading the Bible as Literature, and that was another important time frame. And he wrote in the 90s. Okay, so new literary criticism was actually a thing in the 90s, and it was another discussion being had. Is this a legit way to read the Bible, or is it not? Okay. Characteristics of this are taken apart by David Klein's. It's text-oriented, it can be eclectic, and one really key issue here is that it goes beyond interpretation to actual critique of the text. So when we get to our feminist interpreter who's going, can we even use this for authority? She's kind of moving in that direction, actually, of critique as opposed to just straight off reading of the text. So new literary criticism is of several sorts. New criticism, rhetorical, structuralist, narrative and poetic, and linguistic analysis actually can fit with that. Okay, so the characteristics are that it's unmoored. Texts are looked at as being mere artifacts. There's not information regarding the author, so you don't need to ask. And very ideological, and the reader creates meaning, which I tend to agree with the fact that the reader does create meaning or has a role in creating meaning. Okay, literary criticism and contemporary interpretation. We have extra new at the time that this was written, which was early 2000s, and that includes feminist, materialist, political, psychoanalytical, reader response, and deconstruction, which was quite popular for a while. Okay, so I'm going to turn this off and turn it back on so we can have Abraham and Sarah in one spot so we don't lose them, and I shall return directly.